Hi, Read 516. This is Dr. Keisler, and this is our last screencast for week one. I promise that I will get this whole 15-minute time limit thing fixed on screencasts so that you don't have so many links to click for the rest of the semester. So I will work on that this week. So I wanted to take this last couple of minutes just to talk about what assessment is and go over some key terms in assessment. So these are terms that we're going to be using all year and that they'll be used all year, all semester, and they'll be used in the articles and in our text, and they're probably not unfamiliar to you, but in case they are, why don't we go ahead and go over them. You, this week, needed to take a look at the IRA's glossary of reading terminology, and you needed to go over some select pages in your Lipson and Wixon text, and so some of these came up there. So our kind of questions for the week that we want to consider would be what is assessment? What is the value or purpose behind assessment? In other words, why do we do it? And what should we consider when giving assessments? So why do we assess students? Because we know that we often feel like we spend a whole lot of time doing that. Well, if you think all the way back to your Read 508 text, Rose, Smith, and Burns will tell us that there are three primary reasons that you evaluate students, and they are 1, to provide accountability, 2, to classify students, and 3, to guide our instruction. And so those would be the three reasons, particularly number 2 and 3, that kind of guide the philosophy here in the reading department. We don't necessarily focus as much on number 1 in terms of to provide accountability, where I would say that, we're more concerned with the accountability piece in terms of being able to measure your own progress with a student, but not that external accountability piece. The International Reading Association would tell you that the primary purpose of assessment is to improve teaching and learning. And so obviously that is something that we feel is important too here in the reading department and guides our philosophy of assessment as well. And your core text, which I hope you've had a chance to kind of start leafing through, would tell you that the purpose for assessment is to identify student progress, to prevent reading difficulty, and to provide help to students with reading difficulties. So these are all reasons why we assess our students. So let's go over some of the kind of general assessment terms that we'll be using this semester. So we've got formal and informal assessment. So I'm sure that you've heard of both of these before, but essentially formal assessment is just that use of published standardized tests, while informal, we sometimes call it alternative assessment, is pretty much all assessments but those standardized tests, right? So it's everything else that we do as a classroom teacher or as a reading specialist. So can you think of some examples of informal assessment? That's me giving you a little wait time to think. But some examples of informal assessments would be like observation, your anecdotal records. Next week we'll read that piece by Dr. Boyd Batstone that goes over that. Checklists, rubrics, conferences, interviews. So really all of those things that you do outside of those published standardized pieces. So formative and summative is another or two other terms that we hear used often. And formative assessment is also referred to as assessment for learning, right? So what formative assessment does for us is it answers the question, are students learning, right? So it's the assessment that we can do before and during our teaching to help us inform our instruction. Kind of think of inform and form, right? Summative assessment, on the other hand, is that assessment of learning. So summative assessments answer the question, did students learn? So you see the difference there? And so it's that after the fact assessment in which we look back at what the students have learned. And so that can either be end of unit, end of course, or end of year examinations. Norm versus criterion referenced assessment. So you probably have heard these before. So a norm referenced assessment is an assessment that gives you, in its result or in its score, an idea of how a child performs relative to other children their age or in their grade in a particular domain. So if you took a norm reference assessment in reading, the score that you would get, typically that percentile score, would tell you something like you are in the 76th percentile, meaning that when compared to a large number of students, not just the students in that school or district, but usually a sample is considered nationwide, you would perform better than 76% of students if you were in the 76th percentile. Right? Doesn't mean that you got a 76%, but you are in the 76th percentile. And then we have criterion reference assessments. So criterion reference assessments want to know what children know and what they can do in a given domain. So whether, particularly whether they perform at a defined level on a specific task. So we think about our, let's say, CST as more of a criterion reference assessment, right? So it gives us an idea on how students perform on particular standards, and then it goes ahead and it puts them in those bands of, are they proficient, advanced proficient, so on and so forth. But it gives us an idea of how they do on a particular task on those particular standards. So rather than comparing them and norming them to a percentile grouping based on how other students perform, it gives you an idea of how the individual students perform. Reliability and validity are two more terms that we're going to need to know and go over. So reliability is, and you'll go over this reliability and validity a lot more when you get to 511, or you're in 511 right now, but when you get to that part of the course. But reliability essentially is the extent to which the results of an assessment or the interpretation of those results can be generalized over time across tasks and among the interpreters of the data. So let's say I've got this one assessment, I give it to my fourth graders, I get the results back, I have this test again, I give it to fourth graders the next year. It gives me, not that the scores are the same, but it gives me similar results. So it measures what I need it to measure, and the way that data can be interpreted off that assessment shouldn't be different depending on if I'm looking at it or my partner teacher is looking at it or my other colleague is looking at it. But we would consider that assessment reliable. So those are, reliability goes hand in hand with validity. So when we're talking about validity, what we're talking about is that the test actually measures what it's supposed to measure, right? So let's say, for example, if we claim that an assessment measures reading fluency, but it only measures speed and accuracy and doesn't include other aspects such as, the prosody piece or intonation, then we would say that the test has poor construct validity because it doesn't actually measure the construct of fluency. So you should be familiar with the terms reliability and validity. It's not necessarily something that you do or use day to day, but it's good to know when you're choosing assessments, if they are assessments that are considered reliable and valid. Generally, if it's an assessment that's published, like most of the assessments that you're using now, that you're going to use this semester out of CORE or out of QRI, they're considered reliable and valid. So that work has already been done. Teacher-made assessments that you just make or quizzes you make, probably don't have very good measures of reliability and validity, which is why we don't only use those to assess students. Authentic or performance-based assessment. So authentic assessment, it has to include tasks that are a good reflection of real-world activities. We know that that's something that we're bringing more into our standardized assessments, right? The authentic tasks. Performance-based assessment, also something that we're bringing more into our standardized assessments. Sorry about that. This new computer's killing me. So that's assessment that involves the demonstration of a particular skill and often assesses the process that students would use in accomplishing uh, the performance specific to that skill. So not just, do they get the product, but what was the process to get towards the product or to arrive at the answer. And then the last is portfolio assessment. Portfolio assessment is just an approach to assessment that uses some sort of systematic and multifaceted collection of work that represents a student's development. So it's more than just a published, set of scores over the year. It includes work samples. It includes a mix of formal, informal, and authentic assessment. And the last piece is high stakes tests, right? So another term that we're pretty familiar with, but just think of high stakes as tests that have significant consequences for those viewed as responsible for performance on those tests. So the ones who are taking them, right? And then also the ones who are giving those assessments. So an example might be, tests that determine whether or not one's accepted or rejected into the military or into a university or into some kind of educational program, because they would have significant consequences for the individuals that take that test. All right, so the last piece, we're kind of done with the definitions piece, the assessment terms, but I want you to think about your fieldwork requirements. So remember, I talked about it in the other screencast, but the policy, the practicum policy, can be found on Titanium. Keep in mind that by week 4, you're going to need to start working with a student, and so you're going to be able to provide me with that supporting documentation. The resources for you to get that done are on Titanium as well. And you have 2 options that you can meet to do this fieldwork requirement. So the first was that you have a teaching certificate already, or you have the live scan fingerprint information, and you have a parent permission form, right? So you need to fill that out, even if it's, somebody that whose child that you're working with. Or you can use the permission form for non-credentialed clinicians. So you can find, like I said, both of those will be on Titanium. And then a little bit later, this week or next week, we'll start talking about the videos and the forms that you need to get done for that piece. And so make sure you're just keeping those on your radar, that you need to have that credential or live scan verification, and then you need to have the parent authorization and or the permission form. So those have to be done in order for you to start working with your student, which is week 4. Last piece of information, we have a writing tutor, Heather Brandon. She is actually a graduate of our program several years ago. She often teaches 516 online, but she's in the process of moving, so I'm going to go ahead and teach the online section for her this semester. I usually do the hybrid. And she can offer you, she's a great resource, and she can offer you help in how to, do your APA, how to cite sources, grammar, punctuation, academic language, article analysis, critique, anything that you need basically for this class or for 511. You probably won't need it as much for this class, but I absolutely encourage you to take advantage of it for 511, since you will be writing a literature review for that class. So you can reach Heather at just her hbrandon@fullerton.edu. And I don't believe she's going to be able to meet on campus this semester, because I think she's been in Michigan and they're moving to Sacramento, but her family is from down here, so who knows? She may have some in-person time, but she definitely has on-phone and online time, and she's really good with the tech stuff. And then we're ready to go, right? So keep in mind, this class is a lot. We've got a lot of stuff to get done this semester, but it's going to be a great semester. You're going to learn a lot. And just like Rome wasn't built in a day, neither is your knowledge of reading and reading instructions. So this is just going to be another one of those pieces to add to your toolkit, and just get on it right away. So we need to make sure that we get those forms done and that we're ready to go by week 3 or week 4. All right, have a great week.